Great. Okay, so we are on record now. I welcome our speaker for the day, Professor Mary C. English from Montclair State University, Department of Classics and General Humanities. She has been teaching Latin and Greek at all levels, as well as courses in mythology, ancient drama, and theater history there. And apart from doing these academic works, she has also been very busy as editing, as in her editing works. She has been editing the journal, The Classical Outlook, since from 2003 to 2015. She has also recently uh, started working as the co-editor of the Thornton Wilder Journal, published by Penn State University Press. It was just launched in 2020. She has also edited some very interesting collection of essays. One I would particularly refer to, it's entitled Pushing the Boundaries of Historia. It was published from Routledge in 2018. She has also written numerous articles and book chapters on the staging of ancient comedy and the reception of Greek drama by contemporary American playwrights. So, Professor, we heartily welcome you to our humble department here. Our students, and I can see some faculty members from other colleges have also joined, and probably as we go on, we will see people joining. We have an adverse weather situation here due to an ongoing depression, but I'm keeping my fingers crossed. Probably we will see more people joining. So welcome you again, and a very good morning. For audience, Professor is joining from America, so it's a good morning to her, just like it's good evening to us. So over to you, Professor.
Okay, great. Good evening to everyone. I'm so happy to be here. I'm going to share my screen now for my presentation. So I just need to do that, and then we'll get started.
Sure. I'll confirm when the screen appears.
And then I'll go here. And is it all set?
Yes, all set.
Okay, perfect. All right, so my talk today will be entitled Pentheus, Akoytez, and the Invisible Power of Bacchus. And I just wanted to make reference at the beginning of the presentation that all the quotations from Ovid that appear in the presentation come from an excellent online translation, and I have the URL in the presentation in case you want to look at the online translation later. You can go back to these specific passages. Okay, we'll start very broad today. So my first slide is entitled Ovid and His Controversial Literary Career. So just a few words of review about who Ovid was and what atmosphere he was writing in. So Ovid, and I have his dates, he lived from 43 BCE to 17 CE, and he became perhaps like the most controversial artist in Rome because of the intensity of his love poems. And most notable among those love poems was his Ars Amatoria, which was a didactic poem that gave advice to men and women about the art of seduction. And this poem really cemented his reputation as a cutting-edge, controversial artist. So in the wake of that publication, Ovid began to challenge or be perceived to be challenging the authority of the emperor. And that Emperor Augustus threatened to punish Ovid if he didn't adopt a more conservative approach to his literary pursuits. So Ovid vowed to produce an epic, and that's the work that we're going to look at today, his Metamorphoses. And he promised that this epic would be as illustrious and erudite as Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, or as famous as his contemporary Virgil's Aeneid. So he threw his hat in with these other reputable epic poets and promised to produce a work that was of that caliber. And so, although Ovid's Metamorphoses fulfills this promise, it was almost as irreverent as Ovid's controversial love poems. And so the biggest examples that are always taken from the poem that fulfill that statement are all the tales about Jupiter that highlight the Olympian's extramarital affairs and his abuses of power. And Ovid couldn't resist taking the opportunity to equate Jupiter with Augustus himself. So it's all of these types of like countercultural references that appear in the epic that made even this poem that wasn't overtly about love and seduction just as controversial a work. So then we'll get a little bit more narrower here. We'll narrow our focus from Ovid to the epic itself. Just a few points, like Ovid begins this epic with the creation of the human race, and he proceeds to chronicle the changes that take place from the origin of our species to the rule of Augustus. So the undertaking of this epic is vast, right? That Ovid promised his readers to take them from the stories of creation all the way up to the present day. And then he was going to catalog in between all the myths and legends of their time. So in between, Ovid weaves a mythological web of stories, gathering in one place all the legends associated with the Greco-Roman deities and the heroes. The Metamorphoses can be enjoyed at face value, but there are extra delights for students of Greek and Roman literature, and that's what we're going to focus on today. Ovid takes pride in responding to his literary models. Those are authors like Homer, Virgil, Sophocles, Euripides, and presenting a version of the myth that stands in dialogue with its literary predecessors. So on the one hand, you can read the epic from cover to cover, and you can enjoy hearing the stories for the first time. But if you do have a background in Greek and Roman literature, and Ovid hoped the readers of his time would have that background, then you get a second and third level of nuance in the epic, because Ovid's writing a version of the myth that stands in dialogue or stands next to those literary models. And so if you know the literary model, you can see a different layer of the story, and you can see what Ovid's changing, and the changes affect our interpretation of the tale. So it's a multifaceted work, and that's what makes it so much fun to look at. So we're going to look at the Pentheus episode in book 3, and I thought that we'd start by looking at the context of book 3. Where does this episode appear in the epic? So in this particular book that the Pentheus story appears, Ovid has collected all of the tales involving the cursed city of Thebes. This section of the Metamorphoses begins with Cadmus's unusual founding of the city. And so in that tale, he's on a quest to locate his sister Europa, and Cadmus receives instructions from Apollo to establish a city called Thebes in a place where an unyoked cow leads him. Okay, so he follows the unyoked cow that he meets, and in that spot, Cadmus has to battle a dragon. And at the end of that battle, with the encouragement of Pallas Athena, he's instructed to take the slain dragon's teeth and sew them into the earth. And from that planting emerges a band of militant men with whom he builds Thebes. And so the origin of Thebes, at least according to Ovid, has its root in sort of a masculine military culture, right? That Cadmus battles this monster that's larger than life. He takes the body parts of that slain monster, he sews them into the ground, and from that planting emerges these militant men, and the militant men and Cadmus establish the city of Thebes. Okay, so that's the first section of book 3. Then Ovid goes to tell us some more about Cadmus's grandson. We look at the story of Actaeon. He inadvertently witnesses the goddess Diana bathing, and as punishment, she turns him into a stag, and in that form, he's torn apart and killed by his own hunting dog. So we're going to reference that story in a little bit when we get to the Pentheus narrative. From Actaeon, we go to the story of Cadmus's daughter Semele. Semele is the mortal woman who falls in love with Jupiter and asks for proof of the god's identity. Jupiter grants her wish, and as a result, she's consumed by flames. Jupiter is able to save the child that's in her womb and stitches the fetus into his leg, and from his own limb, the god Bacchus is born. So we actually have the birth of Bacchus as well in book 3. And in the wake of Bacchus's birth, Jupiter asks Tiresias, the seer, who's going to be an important character in our tale today, to judge a dispute between him and his wife Juno. And as a result of brokering this disagreement between the Olympian spouses, Tiresias is struck blind, but he's given accurate knowledge about the future. And that's going to also be important for our tale today. And then from there, Ovid relates the story of Narcissus. He's the young man who falls in love with his own reflection, and he transforms into a flower with white petals and yellow centers because he's so distraught that he can't be united with his love because it's actually himself. Okay, so that's the action of book 3. And so Ovid comes at the end of book 3 and concludes the section with a return to the line of Cadmus. Okay, we started with Cadmus, we went to Cadmus's grandson, we went to Cadmus's daughter Semele, we took a little detour into Narcissus, but then we come back to like Cadmus's line, and we look at Pentheus, who's another one of Cadmus's grandsons. And in this episode, Pentheus is going to defy Tiresias, that blind seer that we just heard about. And he's going to deny the divinity of his cousin Bacchus, right? So that one of Cadmus's daughters had Actaeon, another one of Cadmus's daughters had Semele, and Semele is going to give birth to Bacchus. And then we're going to have another daughter of Cadmus, Agawe, and she's going to give birth to Pentheus. Pentheus is going to deny the prophecies of the seer Tiresias and the divinity of his very own cousin Bacchus. And by the end of the tale, he meets a fate similar to his other cousin Actaeon. Okay, so like he is also going to be ripped to pieces, but the way he's ripped to pieces is different than the way like Actaeon was ripped to pieces. So you can see from this slide, which has a lot of information on it, how Ovid is constructing this complicated narrative, right? I wanted to give you sort of one slide that shows the complexity of Ovid's approach to storytelling and how he's really interweaving so many different tales and tidbits about Greco-Roman mythology. And somehow he constructs a way to unfold the story so we can move from Cadmus all the way to Pentheus. But in between, we have this rich tapestry of tales that interconnects all of the legends. Okay, so what are the literary sources for the Pentheus episode? Remember, I mentioned in the early slides that Ovid's Metamorphoses stands in dialogue with its literary predecessors. So the primary literary source for the Pentheus episode is Euripides' Bacchae, which is a late 5th century BCE Greek tragedy. Okay, so it's a piece of Greek literature that came about 400 years, or appeared about 400 years before Ovid is writing. And in the play, Dionysus, which is the Greek name for Bacchus, he returns to Thebes to avenge his mother's tarnished reputation and to challenge Pentheus, who has denied his divinity. So in some respects, what we're going to see in Ovid's version of the tale is very similar, but it's also going to be a little different. Okay, and one of the most important things that we need to consider about the source, this play by Euripides, is that Euripides chooses to make Dionysus himself, so the Olympian deity himself, is a major character in the play. He has several scenes with Pentheus, and Dionysus himself lures Pentheus to the Theban woods to spy on the activities of his worshippers. And in many respects, he orchestrates Pentheus's death at his mother's hands. So the god himself is an active agent in the events of the tale. So Ovid chooses to follow this plot outlined in Euripides' Bacchae very closely. But into the middle of the narrative, he interweaves a tale from another work called the Homeric Hymn to Dionysus. And in this work, the author recalls an encounter between Dionysus, who's again Bacchus, and some unlucky sailors. One sailor, Akoytez, is spared because he recognizes Dionysus in disguise. So this is a classic example of the way Ovid chooses to approach his literary construction, right? He's taking two works. He's referencing Euripides' Bacchae, and he's following that very famous version of Pentheus's downfall. But into that narrative, he's interjecting the events from this other important work, the Homeric Hymn to Dionysus. So he's blending these two works, and then he's making little updates and changes. And the updates and changes are going to tell us some new and interesting things about the characters. Okay, so what's the structure for the Pentheus episode? I've divided the Pentheus episode into 4 parts. And we're going to look briefly at each of the 4 parts in the slides that follow. So in part 1, we're going to have Tiresias warning Pentheus. In part 2, we're going to see Pentheus ordering the Thebans to disregard Bacchus, to stop their worship of Bacchus. In part 3, we're going to look at how Pentheus arrests Akoytez, this survivor of the crazy incident with the sailors. And that character, Akoytez, gets to tell his story. And when Akoytez tells his story, we're going to have that information that Ovid interwove from the Homeric Hymn to Dionysus. And then we're going to have part 4, which is Pentheus dies at his mother's hands. And that's the big spectacular end of Pentheus at the conclusion of book 3 of the Metamorphoses. So that's a fairly agreed upon structure for the narrative, that you can divide it into these 4 sections. So let's look at some specific passages from each of those 4 sections. So I picked out one particular quote from the first section where Tiresias is warning Pentheus. So remember, he's that blind seer that had to judge the dispute between Jupiter and Juno. And Juno is very upset at that moment in the narrative because of Jupiter's affair with that mortal woman Semele, which resulted in the birth of Bacchus. And so Tiresias pays an awful price for getting involved, or being forced to get involved in their marital dispute. and he winds up being blind but able to predict the future accurately. So here we're going to have Tiresias trying to warn Pentheus that he should respect Bacchus and his divinity, and Pentheus is going to rudely scoff at Tiresias's advice, and he sort of dismisses him as an old man who doesn't really know what he's talking about, right? So this is what Ovid tells us, and he says, still Pentheus, the son of Echion, in scorn of the gods, alone amongst all of them, rejected the seer. And he laughed at the old man's words of augury and taunted him. So that's an important verb, like he mocked him with the darkness and ruin of his lost sight. And now, this is what Pentheus says. This is what Tiresias says. And now the day approaches, and I see it is not far off, when the new god, Liber or Bacchus, the son of Semele, will come. And unless you think him worthy to be done honor in your sanctuaries, you will be scattered, torn in 1,000 pieces, and stain your mother and her sisters and the woods themselves with your blood. And even as he speaks, Echion's son, that's Pentheus, thrusts him away. So that's the big prediction that Tiresias has at the beginning of the episode. Okay, so that he predicts that Bacchus is going to make an appearance, and I'm going to actually put out there that it's Bacchus almost like in an invisible form. He's going to come to Thebes, and Tiresias says that unless Pentheus changes his ways, he's going to meet this crazy end, right? Like here we have at the beginning of the tale, we get the prediction of what will happen at the end of the tale. You will be scattered, torn in 1,000 pieces, and stain your mother and her sisters and the woods themselves with your blood. Okay, and unfortunately for Pentheus, that prediction is going to come true, and that by the end of the tale, we will see that Pentheus will be torn into 1,000 pieces. All right, so if we move on to part 2, right after that section, so the readers get this foretelling of what's going to happen to the main character. Pentheus is seen like rebuking the Thebans for worshiping Bacchus or for acknowledging Bacchus at all. And what he's most upset with is that he can't believe that his city has forgotten its militant origins. So remember, that's that story with Cadmus and the dragon and sowing this teeth in the earth and the band of militant men that emerge from that planting. And so Pentheus wants his city to focus on that aspect of their origin. And he's really upset that instead they're choosing to venerate what he perceives is this sort of false deity. And he's particularly upset with like Bacchus's effeminate qualities. Okay, so that to Pentheus, Bacchus stands in stark contrast with this militant origin of the city. Okay, so Ovid has Pentheus shouting at the citizens of Thebes. Pentheus exclaims, "What madness has stupefied your minds? Can the clash of brazen cymbals, the pipes of curved horn, and magical tricks be so powerful that men who were not terrified by drawn swords or blaring trumpets or the ranks of sharp spears, these men are overcome by the shrieks of women, men mad with wine, crowds of obscenities, and empty drumming? Thebes will be taken by an unarmed boy who takes no pleasure in fighting or weapons or the use of horses, but in mere drenched hair, soft wreaths of leaves, and embroidered robes woven with gold. But if you stand aside, I will quickly force him to confess that his pretended parentage and religion are inventions." Okay, so Pentheus has gotten word that Bacchus has come to town and that he has incited some of the citizens of Thebes to go out to the woods and worship him. And so Pentheus, when he hears about that, he has this exclamation to the city. And all of the things that he mentions in this quote are typical characteristics associated with Bacchus and the way that he's depicted in the iconography of Greece and Rome. So Bacchus is often presented with symbols, with curved pipes, so with these percussion instruments, and he's noted for his effeminate appearance, so that when we get to the second half of the quote, what Pentheus is particularly perturbed by is that Thebes is going to be taken by an unarmed boy. So like a god that looks young and certainly not militant. That character is going to take no pleasure in fighting or in weapons or the use of horses, but he's going to have like perfume drenched hair. He's going to have soft wreaths of leaves in his costume, and he's going to have like beautiful embroidered robes woven with gold. So the antithesis of those militant men that Cadmus founded the city with. Okay. And so what Pentheus wants to do is he wants to force Bacchus to confess that his pretended parentage, that's that affair that Semele had with Jupiter. So he's supposed to confess that he really isn't the son of Jupiter, although he is, and that his religion are inventions. So that's what Pentheus undertakes in the first part of this, or in the second part of my 4-part structure of the tale. He's heard the warnings of Tiresias, and now instead of heeding them, he's going to go in the opposite direction, and he's going to vow to take down Bacchus no matter what. Right? So his attendants, he orders his attendants to go out and find Bacchus and bring him to the court. But instead of finding Bacchus, the attendants in part 3 announce that they've captured an ardent devotee of Bacchus instead. The attendants say they can't find Bacchus anywhere, but don't worry, Pentheus. We got one of his chief followers, this guy Akoytez, and we can punish Akoytez as an example, right? So Ovid tells us, see now, they, Pentheus attendants, return, stained with blood, and when their lord queries where Bacchus is, they deny having seen Bacchus, but reply, we have captured this companion of his, a priest of his sacred rites. And they hand over a man of Tyrian stock, with his hands bound behind his back, a follower of the worship of the god. Pentheus looks at him, with eyes made terrible by anger, and although he can scarcely wait for the moment of punishment, he says, "Oh, you who are about to die, and by your death teach the others a lesson, tell me your name, your parents' name, and your country, and why you follow the customs of this new religion." And so what we're going to get in the lines that follow is Akoytez telling his biography. And in his biography, Ovid interweaves all of that information from the Homeric hymn to Dionysus. Remember, the second literary source. So far, we've been following the narrative of the tragedy, Euripides' Bacchae, but here Ovid diverts course and interjects all of that other material. Okay, so Akoytez tells us a tale from his past about some sailors who were traveling with him, and during one of their journeys, Akoytez is going to be the helmsman of the ship. These other sailors kidnap a young boy and plan to ransom him for money. They plan to sell him. And Akoytez right away recognizes that the boy is a divine figure in disguise, and he tries to stop the sailors from their treacherous plot as well as from their impiety. So Akoytez tries to stop these his fellow sailors from committing this crime. It would have been bad enough to kidnap a young boy and ransom him for money, but Akoytez is like, you've gone crazy. You've kidnapped what I perceive to be as a divine figure, and we're definitely going to pay a price if we don't repent. And so this is what one of his companions says. "See, we are here," said Opheltes, the foremost of my friends, and he led the boy with the beauty of a virgin girl along the shore, a prize, or so he thought, that he had found in a deserted field. The boy seemed to stumble, heavy with wine and sleep, and could scarcely follow. So this is Akoytez speaking. "I examined his clothing, his appearance, and his rank, and I saw nothing that made me think him mortal. And I felt this, and I said to my companions, I do not know which God is in that body, but there is a God within. Whoever you are, oh, favor and assist our efforts and forgive these men." Okay, so Akoytez is going to stand apart from his band of sailors and try to prevent them from committing this atrocity against the young boy who it's going to turn out to be the disguised Dionysus. Okay, so right after Akoytez has this revelation, Bacchus reveals himself and decides to teach the sailors a lesson. He grips the ship with ivy and vines and clusters of grapes, all of these symbols of his divinity, and he waves a makeshift Tiresias, and all of these animals that are associated with him, lynxes, tigers, and panthers, appear at his side. The sailors jump overboard in fear, and Bacchus transforms them into dolphins, and he spares Akoytez. So Akoytez is the only one who survives this incident. So this is the passage here after that introduction that describes how Bacchus reveals himself. "The ship stands still in the waves, just as if it were held in a dry dock. Amazed, the crew keep flogging away at the oars and unfurling the sails. They try to run on with double power, but ivy impedes the oars, creeping upwards with binding tendrils, and drapes the sails with heavy clusters. The god himself waves a rod," that's the makeshift Tiresias, "twined with vine leaves, his forehead wreathed with bunches of grapes. And around him lie insubstantial phantom lynxes, tigers, and the savage bodies of spotted panthers. The men," those are the sailors, "they leap overboard, driven to it either by madness or by fear. And Medon is the first to darken all over his body, and his spine to be bent in an arched curve." So that's going to be like the transition to Ovid describing how once the men leap overboard, they're going to be turned into dolphins, and each one of them sort of undergoes this transmogrification, this morphing of their body from one form into the other. And at the end of that description, Akoytez says, "But Bacchus spared me." And that's why I'm here to tell this tale to you, Pentheus. So any audience member of Akoytez's narration would conclude that you should be very careful when you try to deny Bacchus's divinity. But Pentheus takes no heed of Akoytez's tale. He does not see the warning in the words. He lets Akoytez be taken to the prison, and Bacchus releases Akoytez. He engineers a prison breakout, And in the wake of that prison breakout, Pentheus decides to head off to the woods to spy on what these worshippers of Bacchus are doing. And among the worshippers are going to be his mother and his aunts. Okay? When Pentheus arrives on the scene of this worship, his mother and aunts and the rest of the Theban women mistake him for a wild boar. So if you read between the lines in the tale, you're supposed to imagine that Bacchus has caused them to go mad. They're mistaking humans for animals. So they think Pentheus is a wild boar, and they rush at him and they begin to tear him to pieces. All the while, Pentheus begs them to stop and recognize him as a member of their family. Okay, so we get then in the concluding section of Ovid's tale this gripping account. Okay, so near the middle of the mountainside was a clearing surrounded with remote woods, free of trees and visible from all sides. Here, as he watched the mysteries with profane eyes, his mother was the first to see Pentheus, the first roused to run at him madly, the first to wound him, hurling her thyrsus. They all rush on him in one maddened crowd. They converge together, pursuing the frightened man, frightened now, speaking words free of violence now, cursing himself now, realizing his own offense. Stricken, he still shouts, "Help me, Aunt Atenoe! Let Actaeon's shade move your spirit." She, not remembering Actaeon, tears away the suppliant's right arm. Ino, in a frenzy, rips off another. Now the unhappy man has no limbs to hold out to his mother, but showing his wounded trunk, shorn of its members, he cries, "Mother, see!" Agawe howls, that's the mother, and twists her neck about, and thrashes her hair in the air, and tearing off his head, holding it in her bloody hands, shouts, "Behold, sisters, this act marks our victory." So Ovid's doing a lot of things in this passage. Not only is he recreating Pentheus's spectacular death here, right? He's gone to spy on these women. They mistake him as the wild boar. They attack him and they start to tear him limb from limb. And the ringleaders of this assault are his mother and his aunts. But into the narrative, Ovid weaves the story of Actaeon. This really isn't in Euripides' version of the story. The characters are all there, but Euripides doesn't have the emphasis on Actaeon. But Ovid does, because Actaeon's tale occurred earlier in book 3, right? When I gave that structure of book 3 and said that lots of these incidents were going to be important, I highlighted that the story of Actaeon and how after he saw Diana bathing, she turned him into a stag and had his own hunting dogs tear him limb from limb. And so in some respects, Pentheus's fate is similar. He's going to be torn limb from limb, but at the end of book 3, Ovid has raised the stakes, right? It's no longer animals mistaking another animal and ripping them apart. Here we have human beings mistaking Pentheus for an animal, but he's still in his human form, right? Pentheus hasn't undergone any metamorphosis like Actaeon did. So Pentheus is a human being. The attackers are human beings, and it's only that power of Bacchus that has caused the women to go mad that then they mistake Pentheus for an animal, and they begin their attack. And then the prophecy of Tiresias comes true, that Pentheus is torn into 1,000 pieces, with his mother and his aunts as the ringleaders of the death. Okay, so those are some highlights, and they're pretty extensive highlights of the four sections of the Pentheus episode. So what can we take away from that? So how does Ovid transform the tale of Pentheus? In addition to fusing the two literary sources, Euripides' Bacchae and the Homeric hymn to Dionysus, Ovid removes Bacchus from the action of the story. Pentheus never confronts Bacchus directly and proceeds on his own to the Theban mountainside. So Ovid has made a conscious choice in this narrative to make Bacchus invisible, that like the power of Bacchus is just out there, and that it's something to be feared, but it's not the tangible character that was in Euripides. In fact, the notable absence of Bacchus in the tale has prompted some scholars to see the character of Akoytez as Bacchus in disguise. So that's like one layer of scholarly interpretation for this tale. And this reading is very tempting because it forges another link between Ovid's two sources. In Euripides' Bacchae, Pentheus jails Dionysus, and then Dionysus breaks free. So we have that jailing here. We have Akoytez taken prisoner. He tells his tale. He gets put in the prison. And in the original version, that's Dionysus himself. So here in Ovid, the jailed Akoytez, perhaps Bacchus in disguise, tells a story that should warn Pentheus that he's traveling down a dangerous path. But again, Pentheus ignores the tale and the teller. So Akoytez has been characterized according to adjectives that could possibly describe Bacchus, right? He's a young man. He looks unthreatening. That's what gives Pentheus the courage to sort of mock him. Then Pentheus dismisses him at the end of his tale. He puts him in prison, and Akoytez is able to break free. And so that incident occurs in one of the literary sources, that Euripides' Bacchae. But here, Ovid's made it all ambiguous. You as the reader have to decide whether to take like Akoytez at face value, or whether to imagine that maybe he is Bacchus in disguise, or maybe he's partly Bacchus in disguise. It works in many readings. And in some respects, the beauty of it is that Ovid doesn't give you any clues as to whether Akoytez is really Bacchus or is just an ardent follower of the deity. All right, and then we sort of covered the third bullet when we were going over the quotes. Ovid also links Pentheus to the other young men in Book 3, although Actaeon's transgression against Diana is inadvertent. He doesn't set out to see her bathing naked. He does it by accident. So that lies in stark contrast to Pentheus's transgression against Bacchus is intentional. Their fates are similar. Both men are torn apart limb from limb. Ovid's Pentheus also embodies the willful arrogance of Narcissus, whose rejection of so many lovers leads him to fall in love with his own reflection. We looked at that story earlier on in the presentation. And Pentheus, like Narcissus, has many chances to repent. He can repent after Tiresias's warning. He can repent after Akoytez's tale, but he arrogantly chooses to stick with his principles rather than heed the warnings. And as a result, he meets with a sad end. Okay, so some final thoughts before we go to questions. And And so in this tale, we see Ovid as an extraordinary myth maker who both engages with his literary sources and transforms the myth into a fresh and contemporary narrative. So it's not just pasting story A and story B together. He's making some interesting choices when he uses those literary sources and combines them in certain ways. In our tale, the gods do not toy with Ovid's Pentheus directly. In fact, Ovid removes Bacchus from direct appearance in the action of the tale. Pentheus brings the wrath of Bacchus upon himself and decides to ignore Tiresias. His attendants arrest Akoytez. He fails to recognize the warning embedded in Akoytez's narrative, and Pentheus decides to approach the Bacchants on the Theban mountainside of his own free will. So I think that by making Bacchus far more invisible in this tale, Ovid has really sort of changed the narrative a bit. And although we sense Bacchus at every turn in the story, and maybe even disguised as Akoytez, Pentheus is the primary agent of his own downfall, or he plays a much more active role in his end than he does in for example, in Euripides' Bacchae or in other versions of the story. Okay, and then I have I'll just show the last slide, some suggestions for further reading. The one I think that's the most germane to what I was talking about today is the last article on the bibliography by John Miller, Ovid's Bacchic Helmsman and Homeric Hymn 7, because what John Miller does in that article that I didn't have time to do today is he looks at the literary history of the sources. So are there other works? Remember I said that Euripides' Bacchae was 400 years before Ovid's writing his Metamorphoses. Are there other sources in between that Ovid's also utilizing? And there are. Some of them exist in fragments. Some of them exist in through references to other works. But the stories of Dionysus and Bacchus did evolve during the 400 years that separates sort of Ovid's primary source from his own epic. And what Miller does is take you through those more arcane sources in a very sort of interesting way. And so, although he links Ovid's choices like I did through those two main works, he also takes you through some of the lesser known works and what Ovid might be employing from those sources. So that one I think has particular. If you're interested in what I talked about today, that would be like the next step. And then these take other aspects of the other four sources take other aspects of the narrative. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and return to the presentation. So I think if okay, hold on. Can't seem to.
I have already pinned you on the screen, so
okay.
You are visible to all of us, but your presentation is still there in one
okay, I can't
of the
seem
boxes.
To.
Do you see that option that says stop sharing?
Yes, here I go. I think I got it.
You have to just touch
yes,
that.
there I am. Right, I'm back.
Okay. I'll come to giving my concluding remarks, but before that, I think I have some senior faculty members here, and I think all of us, particularly the faculty members, have learned a lot from your presentation about how to bring in remarkable lucidity. I'm amazed. I mean, the way you have compressed this extremely layered tale that has so many things going on with such remarkable lucidity. I think we just can't thank you enough for that. But I'll now open the platform for questions, comments, and observations. I am sure there will be quite some interesting thoughts stirred by this wonderful presentation. Okay, so audience, and I request our students, since some of you take a little bit of time to, correlate your thoughts in your region, in our regional vernacular language to English. If you feel, you can mention your queries or comments in the chat box in our own language, Bangla. I will be translating that to Professor. Okay, so here is Dr. Shilpi Boshak. She is one of my seniors and she has thanked you for the presentation. I would request you all to please go ahead with your queries, or else, like I have been doing for the last few days, normally I, as the host, take the privilege of setting the ball into motion by asking my beat of queries. So I think I should do that and hope that meanwhile the chat box will be filled with more interesting questions. So Professor, I am really intrigued by the way this the story keeps on referring to Thebes, and then we have someone in Thebes who has an attitude problem. He keeps on defying people. He sometimes even, particularly the his way of defying Tiresias. I think it all somehow makes me remember Oedipus in a very interesting manner. So, has there been any kind of observation, discussion regarding this possible connection? I might be wrong, of course, but if you would like to comment on that.
Yes, I think that there is a subtle, in some respects, reference to Oedipus. Oedipus is probably, like you said, our most famous member of Thebes, right? Like, and not just in the present time, but in the Greco-Roman period as well. And in Sophocles's Oedipus the King, the big famous version of the story, Oedipus does ignore the warnings and then goes to find out who murdered the former king, and it turns out that he does, right? That he's actually killed his father and married his mother, just like the warnings and the oracles told him. But what's, I think, so notably different here, and I think you're right to point it out, is that in the story of Oedipus, we're constantly reminded by Sophocles that he's trying to do the right thing, right? There's a plague that's in his city. He wants to help his people. He wants to stop the plague by finding out the cause of this murder. And then as a result of his investigation, he suffers. And so although he's sort of, as many critics have said, blinded by his arrogance, or sort of headstrong and stuck in one direction, his motivations seem more honorable, right? And here, Pentheus's motivations don't seem honorable at all. Like that initial scene that we saw in part 1 that I described, he's like kind of making fun of Tiresias, and I had to abbreviate the quote, but if you go back and read it in class with the students, he like makes fun of his hair and the fact that he's blind. It's very unbecoming, right? Like he makes fun that he's old and disabled, right? And then he sort of says like, and I get out of here, like have no time for your prophecies. And you're right, that stands in very stark contrast to Oedipus, who does ignore Tiresias, but at least partly he's ignoring them because he wants the plague to stop in Thebes, right? Which is a good thing. So and here we don't get any sense that Pentheus is acting from an honorable source. And that's sort of when Ovid has these depictions of rulers he often takes the opportunity to make them like more tyrannical and more despotic, right? And that's, of course, what that comes back to my first slide. That's what's going to get him into big trouble, right? Because he's in some respects hinting that by switching to an empire, Rome is experiencing this under Augustus as well. Like let us think about our own leader and whether he's behaving like Pentheus. And he never quite says that, but you always get the sense that Ovid's pushing buttons by sort of taking these opportunities to make these monarchs look as sort of self-indulgent as possible. Yeah.
Okay, so since we are still waiting for questions to arrive, I would again take the opportunity to ask a second question, which when I was discussing the text with my students, this appeared. So I'm also speaking on behalf of them as well. That is, Professor, as we all know that this theme of transformation is what connects all these disparate, eclectic at times stories, this eclectic approach of Ovid. And from that point of view, I was wondering if this tale that we just listened to from your perspective, this is also about the transformation of Pentheus from a boastful, and I would particularly lay emphasis on this word stubborn, because in our culture, I am not so sure about other cultures, but in our culture, we associate stubbornness often with boars. And from that particular thing, keeping that particular thing in mind, I think it's very significant that Pentheus towards the end is being compared with particularly a boar. And
Right.
as you just explained, that it was probable that the people who killed Pentheus, including his mother, were probably in some sort of trance. But still, I think this particular animal that is specifically mentioned, that is boar. Can we just relate his stubbornness, his transformation of stubbornness into a boar?
Yes, and I think it is particular that it's that animal, right? For all the metaphoric reasons that you just outlined, as well as it's a big animal, right? A wild boar is a big animal, right? That they're going to pull to pieces. It's not a bird or even like a snake or something like that. It's this huge sort of beast. And these women, and it does reference the play Euripides Bacchae, that in the Bacchae we get these descriptions of what's happened to the Theban women on the mountainside, that Dionysus or Bacchus has given them like superhuman strengths. They're on the one hand able to commune with nature. They're out there drinking wine and relaxing on the rocks and in the woods, so that there is a feminine quality to what they're doing, but he's also imbued them with this superhuman strength, right? And so when you think that the older women of the city, because Pentheus must be like in his 20s, and so like these women are in their 40s and 50s, are descending upon this wild boar, they capture him right away and pull him limb to limb. So the choice of animal, I do think, is important, right? Because Pentheus, I mean, it's a literary work, not a play, or a written work, not a play, but we are I think, to imagine Pentheus embodying those qualities that he likes so much at the beginning of the story, right? Like that he's militant and masculine in very stereotypical traditional terms. And that's why he doesn't like Bacchus. Right now, Ovid doesn't emphasize that in the same way as some of the sources, but he does it through the reference to that Cadmus tale at the beginning, right? And he keeps using traditionally masculine terms, like, remember your militant origins. Like, why are you worshiping this deity who's perfumed and wearing fancy clothes and has never touched the spear or ridden the horses, right? Like, so, and yet at the end of the tale, the women who destroy Pentheus have the strength that Cadmus and the militant men have in the beginning, right? Like Cadmus is able to slay the dragon, and these women are able to take down the boar. Do we have anything
Yes,
in the chat?
yes, we have one question from
Okay.
our student, Sabana. Thank you, Sabana, for the question. She asks, how do the theme and scope of Ovid's Metamorphoses differ from the typical examples of epic poetry?
I think that's a great question, because it's the question that has frustrated a lot of scholars about characterizing this as an epic, right? Like the other famous epics from this period and these cultures feature heroes. And so that's often what we read about in the literary handbooks, that the epic poem is going to have a hero. The hero is going to go on a journey, and we follow that journey from a crisis, some sort of crisis that's in the text, to a resolution. And we see that in Homer's Iliad and in his Odyssey as well. But what Ovid's done is take the form of the epic, and then, as we've been discussing, pieces together all of these tales. Sometimes the connections are strong and some of them are a bit weaker, but what he's deciding is epic is sort of the formidable tapestry of all these legends. And when I discuss this poem with my students in class, I like to think of the average individual as really the hero, right, of the poem. That in some moments we're all going to identify with different characters, different mortal characters in the epic, and that we're supposed to see a lot of these things, or these narratives, as cautionary tales to us, right? So maybe hopefully we'll never be as arrogant as Pentheus, or be in the crazy situation Pentheus finds himself in the tale. But we should be cautious about not doing some of the things that Pentheus is doing, right? Like from the smaller things in the narrative, like rejecting the advice of his elders, like Tiresias, to not being open-minded about different things, right? So what I think Ovid is cautioning his readers is that we're the epic heroes of our own lives, right? And that we're battling these great forces every day: pride, arrogance, short-sightedness. We're epic, and we have to then make epic choices, and I have that like in quotes, every single day of our lives. And so he has made the hero much more metaphorical than in some of the epics that follow the traditional pattern.
Okay, so we have another question again from Sabana. Although this is not particularly focused on Bacchus, but I think nevertheless it's an interesting question. She's talking about how the creation myth, as depicted in Ovid's Metamorphoses, differ from other versions of the creation myth.
So, I mean, there's lots of creation myths that span like different cultures, but what Ovid's doing, I think, differently in this one is sort of a topic for another talk. But that Ovid's blending both the creation stories from his own culture, and then in very subtle ways, I think in those introductory pages of the Metamorphoses, he's introducing science. And he's going to come back to science at the end in book 15 of his epic, and put a lot of the current theories about philosophy and science and math in the last chapters. They're subtle, but a lot of the writers in Ovid's period are interested in scientific things, including Lucretius, who's writing his own science and philosophical epic out there, just about like 30 or 40 years before Ovid's writing. And so he has like that science. He actually says that sort of like that he blends myth and science, and sort of has creation come out from like the chaos, and from chaos then and sort of the swirling around of states in the universe, he's going to like emerge the creation of the human race. So like he has sort of that very early blending of myth and science, but he does it very artfully and doesn't do it too heavy-handed in either way, keeping sort of within the tone of this poem that you can read what you want into it. Some people might think the introduction of science is subversive, and other people might just think that it's a tale that Ovid, you could take at face value.
Okay, so we have another question from Monica. Once again, she's our student. She wants to talk about the afterlife of Metamorphoses.
Well, the afterlife of the Metamorphoses, again, huge topic. Books and books on the afterlife of the Metamorphoses.
Yes. These are very loaded questions.
They're very loaded questions. The Metamorphosis has an afterlife starting even in the ancient world. So that's like one way to answer that question. I'm not going to take too much time to do that today, because probably in the course that you're reading, you're not going to read some of the epics and poems that come 100 years later. Sort of like most of the survey courses focus on the classical world. But even like 100 years later, authors were excited about Ovid and using it. The next big period that comes for Ovid is in the Renaissance. And perhaps the most famous author that makes a lot of use of Ovid is Shakespeare. And so I think I heard that one of the other tales you're reading is Pyramus and Thisbe. So you'll see like a way, if you look at that tale, how Shakespeare has sort of not just taken the legend and put it in his play, but he's making specific references to the Ovid's version of it. So that I often read that scene with my students right after we do the Pyramus and Thisbe story, because I don't think you can appreciate it fully unless you've read the Ovid, or it makes it more fun. And then Ovid has affected writers basically from the Renaissance to the present day. So that Ovid had a big resurgence sort of in the US in the mid, or like in the very early years of the 2000s, right? Like a playwright named Mary Zimmerman took the like about 10 or 15 tales from Ovid and put them together into a play. The play actually went to Broadway. Like it was a big success for Ovid, like all these years later. And then because of that work, a lot of other contemporary American playwrights have taken aspects of Ovid, and what I think characterizes their work, it's very 21st century, is that they're interested in shifting the perspectives in a lot of the stories. So Sarah Rule, who's a big contemporary American playwright, she took the story of like Orpheus and Eurydice for her play Eurydice, and she switches it and tells the story from the woman's perspective, not from Orpheus's perspective, but from Eurydice's perspective. So in some respects, it's a homage to Ovid, because that's where we get the first literary version of the story. But then it's very different, right? Because she doesn't have an ancient literary source for Eurydice, she makes up Eurydice's story, but she makes it up with specific reference to the original poem, which is nice.
Okay, so we have had another question. Would you have time for that, Professor, or should we move to the concluding part?
Oh, I think I can answer just very quickly, the stated scope. Again, a big question, but the stated scope of Ovid is Ovid actually has a very limited scope in the opening lines of the the poem, and that is fun. You can go back and like look at the opening lines of the poem. He's going to tell his audience that there's no pressure here. It's just story time, right? I'm going to take the stories from the beginning of creation and go all the way up to the present. And I'm going to try to put as many stories as I can into one location and one group of poems. But as we saw just from looking at one tale this morning, each one is loaded. It has all of these literary like sources that inform it, and the way Ovid's working really betrays that opening remark, right? He's really not just telling tales in the Metamorphoses, but that's what he tells you he's doing. He's just, don't worry, sit back, enjoy the tales, and he's really doing a lot more and having a much more nuanced discussion with those audience members that want more out of their read.
Okay, Professor, I knew it was the last question, but someone was disconnected, and the person in question has hurriedly posted her comments and observation here. Hi, this is from Shanghamitra Mukherjee, who is also a faculty member. Hi, Professor, excellent presentation. I have a question. Nowadays, there is a trend of overanalyzing texts. Keeping that in mind, do you think we should read the dislike for Bacchus as body shaming or homophobia because he appears effeminate? What about reading the episode of Metamorphoses as an anti-alcohol campaign?
I think that what I'm going to sort of say is not necessarily it. I don't think Ovid has those things necessarily as his agenda, but he definitely wants you to think of Pentheus as embodying those qualities, right? Pentheus is going out of his way to note Dionysus's or Bacchus's character effeminate qualities. And that is a tension that exists in lots of the Greek sources and if you look at the modern philosopher like Nietzsche is very interested in comparing Dionysus with Apollo. And Apollo is going to have traditionally masculine qualities, and like Dionysus is going to be considered the other. So definitely like Pentheus is afraid. That's not, I don't think, reading too much into the tale of these other qualities that Dionysus has. And yes, Pentheus in the tale doesn't like the drinking. He doesn't like the drinking. He doesn't like the carousing. He doesn't like what he almost considers Bacchus like a gateway drug, right, to all of these vices in the community. So in Euripides' version of the story, he still makes Pentheus not that appealing, but he emphasizes more of Pentheus's like nobility, like we were talking about with Oedipus, that there's a worry in the leader that this bad behavior in the community has to be curtailed. And there's some public good that Pentheus is at least insisting that he's achieving. And Ovid, of course, has stripped that out, right? And maybe that really is informing Pentheus's decisions, but Ovid doesn't emphasize it, right? And he's making then Pentheus dislike all of the behavior that's in that you referenced in your question.
Okay, Shanghamitra has thanked you for confirming her belief, and she has also added that a text should be read in context of the time and society it is written. So she's also in agreement with you. Okay, so we were having an extremely engaging discussion in the Q&A session, but I am like a villain cutting it short because I know Professor has the entire day, the Sunday. We all know we do relax on Sunday, but I think she has spared a very engaging session for us. We thank you for that. But Professor, I would also take the liberty to share one instance of something in our Indian mythology that I think resembles the myth of Bacchus to a certain extent. I'm not the first person to point this out. There has always already been some writings on this, but there is this king the king is named Jubonasho, King Jubonasho. He was referred in Mahabharata, and he was the pregnant king. He gave birth to his son because he drank a potion that was supposed to impregnate one of his wives by mistake, and after that he had to give birth to his son, who is named Mandhata, and he has very interesting similarities with Pentheus, because he eventually becomes boastful. And I would also like to add that in this tale of Jubonasho and Mandhata, there was the intervention of the king of gods for us, that is Lord Indra. So I was just remembering these things, and for people interested, I would also mention that Devdutt Patnaik's book, The Pregnant King, this is an interesting retelling of this story. I think we can also perhaps connect Bacchus with the pregnant king, Pentheus with Mandhata in coming years, because I think these discussions are also meant to be exchange of these mythical stories that we have that help us understand our origin, our culture. So, Professor, it was a sheer pleasure listening to you. And I have always been a great fan of fairy tales since my childhood. And I was also wondering if one of the most subtle, probably covert impacts of Metamorphoses has been the fairy tales' perennial theme of transformation. I mean, we see princesses transforming from one form to the other, cursing people, and then they're being changed back by love, etc. So all these things were stirred in my mind while listening to you, just as a listener, but I should also thank you as a host. And I have already started reading your wonderful writings. I hope to have a better understanding of them in future as well. And just as a reader, my request to you, maybe you should consider coming up with some wonderfully introduced annotated text of Ovid in future. That would be a great help. I mean, the Norton edition is wonderful, but I think we can have a friendlier, a more lucid retelling annotation from you. That would be a request.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed my time today with you, and perhaps I can come back another time to have another talk.
I will be badgering you again next year with the request for a class on Pyramus and Thisbe, and maybe something else as well. I'm not revealing that. Let's keep that as a little bit of surprise.
A secret. And I'll share my PowerPoint with you, so that if anybody wants to look at the bibliography and things like that. I saw a typo or two, so I'm going to go fix those, and then I'll send them off.
Sure. And since the session was recorded, it will also be published in YouTube. We will be sending you the link right away. So thank you so much, Professor, for this wonderful presentation. And maybe in future, if we can have the time, if we can have the opportunity, we would also invite you to our country to listen to wonderful Latin myths and maybe exchange a few of our own myths with you. So thank you, Professor. Have a very good day.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.